Let's begin by simply closing our eyes. Take some time to become aware of what is happening in your body. Notice any tension you may be feeling. Simply acknowledge that tension. Tense that area up and let the tension go. Now, bring your awareness to your thoughts. Just notice them. What are they saying to you? And as you acknowledge them, notice if any tension builds within your body or where tension may be residing already. Again, simply notice your thoughts. Imagine they are all floating by you into a huge jar. Now, empty that jar and watch them as they disappear. Now take a very deep breath, releasing any residual tension. Open your eyes and notice how you're feeling. This exercise in awareness is an essential component in the practice of mindfulness. Now that you have experienced one of the fundamental components to mindfulness, I'd like us each to ask ourselves, what is mindfulness? Take a moment and jot down your answer. In Mindfulness for Beginners, Jon Kabat-Zinn described mindfulness as, quote, awareness cultivated by paying attention in a sustained and particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally, unquote. He then links mindfulness with meditation, quote, it is one of many forms of meditation, unquote, in that through directing our attention and energy, we influence the quality of our experience in order to expand our humanity and our relationships. This is what is meant when we think mindfully. Thinking mindfully is a practice that brings us to regulating our attention so we can be aware of our thoughts, our emotions, and our feelings, and with practice, our habits of mind. This practice of, quote, seeing and observing, unquote, our thoughts, sets us apart from our thoughts. It provides us a space where we can choose to influence and transform how we see, act, and bring new meaning to our world. Why is seeing and observing our thoughts so important? And what does this ability have to do with affecting real and lasting change? Take a moment and come up with why you think awareness is so important for real and effective change to occur. Becoming the observer is important because this awareness practice makes us conscious of our inner movements, our perceptions, intuitions, feelings, physical, emotional, and as importantly, the capacity to recognize our habits of mind. Where habits of mind are a set of broad, generalized assumptions which identify behaviors that are acceptable and unacceptable. Habits of mind are blueprints for interpreting, understanding, relating to, and acting in the world. Sometimes habits prevent effective and real change. Sometimes they lock us into reactive and repetitive behaviors whose results are not what we desire. How do we break habits and change the way we think? When was the last time you tried to break a habit like eating too much chocolate? Were you able to do it? How long did it last if you did? If you were able, then good. However, more than likely, the rational approach of recognizing a habit and stating that you want to break it simply did not work. Even though we say we will not eat too much chocolate, we end up doing it anyway. So, how can we break habits? First, we become aware of the way we think. We recognize how our habits of mind, the way we think, move us to act in a habitual way, like being driven to eating too much chocolate. Why does this rational method not work? Because rationality is not the only way we know. We know rationally, intuitively, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. By relying solely on our rationality, we are not aware of, nor do we use our other ways of knowing. As Davidson and Begley stated, quote, "In fact, the circuitry of the emotional brain often overlaps with that of rational thinking brain. Emotion works with cognition in an integrated and seamless way to enable us to navigate the world of relationships, work, and spiritual growth. A feeling permeates virtually everything we do. There is no clear dividing line between emotion and other mental processes." Close quotes. How do we break a habit? The first step in breaking a habit is to observe, be aware of our habits of mind, which include our physical and emotional feelings, in a non-judgmental way, as Kabat-Zinn stated. Quote, "Paying attention in a sustained and particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally," unquote. In our exercise, we simply observed our thoughts. We did not judge them to be good or bad. Rather, we watched them as they floated into the jar. This practice brings us to awareness of our inner movements, our thoughts, our emotional drivers, and our physical feelings. Through this purposeful, non-judgmental practice, we begin to develop what Viktor Frankl characterized as the space between. Quote, "In between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." End quote. In this observing, we are in the moment. As Kabat-Zinn stated, quote, "It is in living our experience in the present moment without evaluating or judging it. Being in the moment of the space between is seeing with different eyes. It is seeing mindfully. It is a form of neuroimaging where, quote, "the activity in the orbital frontal cortex, the core of the habitual circuit of the brain, falls dramatically compared with what it had been before mindfulness-based practice. Thinking about thoughts in a new way alters patterns of brain activity." Davidson and Begley. The space between is the space before decisions and after stimulus, where we see optional possibilities pass in front of us, and where we, quote, think about thoughts in a new way, unquote. We can now choose new patterns of thought and different behaviors which lead to new outcomes. Because we see differently, we are able to break old habits of mind. We can respond differently rather than react in our usual way. It is in that response that, quote, lies our growth and freedom, according to Frankl. When mindfulness becomes our everyday practice, the space between is present even when we are not sitting in meditation. This is referred to by Chade-Ming Tan as mindfulness in activity. Mindfulness in activity expands our consciousness because we are in a space where we observe options. We see things differently. We see with a detachment from the drivers that determine specific behaviors. We see with different eyes. This is the space where discovery, options, and our free choice to change can happen. This is the space where we observe, non-judgmentally, our internal dynamics, thoughts, and habits of mind, and then choose freely rather than reacting habitually. Because we now see with different eyes, we have a different vision, a type of vision that when practiced by a group affects organizations and businesses. We sometimes characterize this vision as a corporate vision and culture. The idea of corporate vision is more than simply writing down the future goals of an organization. A vision emanates from our mind's eye, from our patterns of thought, from our personal and organizational core values. In today's business environment, many organizations are realizing that while the bottom line is essential, it is not the highest value, because businesses exist within a context of a larger community. They have a responsibility to the larger community. Kirk Johnson's April 24, 2016 New York Times article demonstrated this insight. Amazon's growth in Seattle was affecting housing prices and became, quote, a target of some residents and politicians who have criticized it as an insular corporate giant, uninterested in addressing the problems of its home city, unquote. In response, Amazon, quote, stepped into a new place of civic engagement, unquote, by creating, in partnership with a nonprofit group called Mary's Place, quote, one of the largest homeless shelters in Seattle, unquote. But the important element here concerns an apparent shift in consciousness for a big corporation. As Seattle's mayor, Ed Murray, stated, quote, the real significance of the project is the new relationships that Amazon appears to be forging with the city it calls home, unquote. An example of businesses' emerging social consciousness is exemplified by the creation of the Benefit Corporation in California, where businesses incorporate within their corporate bylaws and business models specific social and environmental targets they must meet or be held legally accountable. No longer is the bottom line the highest value. Patagonia's mission statement demonstrates this shift in consciousness to higher order values. Quote, build the best product, cause no unnecessary harm, use business to inspire and implement solutions to the environmental crisis, unquote. The statement exemplifies values that are characterized as SER, or social environmental responsibility, and demonstrate that a business can do well by doing good. But what do these values have to do with envisioning in an organization? Our visions, both individually and collectively, as represented in mission statements, core values, and organizational culture, represent the way we see the world, our underlying values. As stated above, mindfulness allows us to more clearly see our habits of mind and thus also allows us to clarify what our motivations and values are. And one of the habits of mind we may hold is an understanding and vision of leadership grounded on an 18th century industrial paradigm where leadership and organizational models are hierarchical, instrumental, and objectivist in nature. They frame how we think, creating habits of mind that are instrumental and linear. The industrial paradigm views leadership as top-down, power as seen as power over others, and the purpose of leadership is seen as functionalist and is aimed at accomplishing short-term tasks or goals. Its purpose is to accomplish ends by authoritative means. In short, if leadership is grounded in these functional values, it is simply management under a different moniker. The objectivist values of the industrial model of leadership delimits our thoughts, leading to decisions that reinforce the status quo, a perspective that dictates a linear approach to problem solving, leading to singular possible outcomes. Because many of these objectivist outcomes conflict with the emerging business models of the values of the 21st century, the question arises as to how to change our habits of mind from the industrial paradigm to post-industrial leadership. From seeing leadership as management to practicing 21st century leadership that is grounded in higher order values while still making business profitable. How can business do well by doing good? The answer to this question is tied up with what it means to do meaningful work. What is meaning? Sullivan provided an insight into the necessity of broadening our consciousness if we are to have meaningful life. For him, modern societies must balance our, quote, several social processes, unquote, such as our technical expertise with our moral and cultural milieu. It is through conscious interaction of these elements that the, quote, potential of modernity arise, unquote. He believes that it is the task of people, groups, and organizations to be part of an, quote, interacting public discussion of our societal problems. Civic democracy demands the ability to think in terms of complex balances rather than the maximization of effectiveness as measured by a single objective, unquote. He too sees the limitations of living in a cultural milieu whose ethos is objectivist, singular, and manipulative. A society's whose highest value is the accomplishment of immediate tasks and goals in service to only the bottom line. In the 21st century, our understanding and practice of leadership demands that people engage others while being aware of the complexity of the engagement. It entails thinking in a complexity of balances, balancing influence with relationship, purpose with values. Engaging in the leadership process expands the possibilities that are limited by technical and instrumental thinking. It is concerned with inclusion, influence, mutual purposes, and effective and lasting changes. It is concerned with the larger community and not just the physical success of an organization. 21st century leadership uses the immediate or short-term goals, our tasks, as the transport on which mutual purposes ride, while aiming to effect real and lasting changes. 21st century leadership demands the ability to think in terms of complex balances rather than the maximization of effectiveness as measured by a single objective. To think in a single objective mode is to think instrumentally and to be caught in the limitations of the industrial paradigm. However, to move from an instrumental objectivist paradigm to a value system that intends real change and is steeped in inclusion and mutual purposes necessitates broadening how we think. We must begin to think mindfully and think together. With a new leadership value system comes new metaphors, new patterns of thought and behaviors, and a new dynamic process definition of leadership, where leadership is an influence relationship among collaborators who intend real changes that reflect mutual purposes. As a dynamic collaborative process, leadership is no longer what one group or person does to others, but what emerges when collaborators work to effect real changes that reflect mutual purposes. 21st century leadership is collaborative. It solves present and future problems by including the capacities, ideas, and talents of others. Viewed in this post-industrial frame, organizations can recapture the meaning and responsibilities of living in a democratic society while providing people with greater meaning in their everyday labor. Meaning at work is no longer limited to completion of tasks or goals. The significance of one's labor is seen in context of engaging others in accomplishing mutual purposes. One's labor may now be seen as intending to do good for the commons, not simply as performing and accomplishing a task for an immediate goal. No longer does hierarchical, objectivist, and instrumental thinking hold sway on our individual and collective consciousness. What is instrumental thinking? Instrumental thinking concerns itself with means rather than ends or final values. It asks relentlessly, how well is this approach working? Could it be improved? What kinds of improvement will be effective at the least cost? Instrumental thinking deprives us of deeper meaning by depriving us of alternative ways of thinking. It is linear and limited, seeking specific endpoints. Instrumental thinking is akin to surface knowledge that embraces the mechanics of any subject. It is concerned with information, the facts, procedures, and behaviors necessary to perform a specific function. It resides in the taxon systems of the brain and is concerned with memories that must be rehearsed. It is akin to training, not personal development. Instrumental thinking is not creative. Its linearity doesn't call for alternative thought or conclusions that lead to real change. It seeks one right answer. Instrumental thinking is not concerned with meaning or fulfillment. It is linear and is concerned with specific outcomes. However, in today's society, where we find change to be the norm, we must then ask, how can we change? The motivation for change rests in our search for meaning. It resides in asking fundamental questions about why we do things and what meaning is there in what I am doing. Unless there is meaning in why we act, then there will be no motivation to change the way we act and the way we think. Because instrumental thinking is a habit of mind, it prevents us from asking these types of fundamental questions. It is in searching for meaning and broadening our consciousness, and by asking fundamental and reflective questions, that we gain motivation to change. As Kanan Kane stated, quote, "The search for meaning is at the heart of intrinsic motivation, and much of the energy and drive to pursue goals and engage in essential tasks comes from the search for meaning," unquote. Meaning is tied up with our creativity, our personal and cultural relationships, and as such, we must create organizational cultures that foster a cultural consciousness grounded on creativity and relationships. We can do this by incorporating mindful practices that, as we have seen, help us change our habits of mind from an 18th century value set to a 21st century value set. How can mindful practices affect the culture within an organization? How can the shift in perspective bring the possibility of making more work meaningful? These are cultural questions, where culture is seen as an ongoing living expression of who we are collectively. To change and nourish culture, we must learn how to think together. The bureaucratic model does not invite people to think together. Its organizational structure isolates people from each other. Learning to think together entails listening to oneself and the other, coming to realize what you and the other believe and feel without prejudice. It involves going beyond the surface issues to problems and everyday challenges we face individually and collectively. And yet, paradoxically, thinking together uses these problems, issues, and everyday challenges as vehicles to get to the deeper and real issues that bring us together as human beings. This is real collaboration, where our concern is with what our goals ought to be. Collaborating is thinking together about issues that matter to each of us and to the organization. Quote, essential questions of the heart and mind. Cultural change is dependent on changing the way we think. Changing from the industrial model and its status quo and mechanistic worldview to a post-industrial value set that reflects higher order, humanizing principles that no longer suppress individual and communal creativity. I have one last reflection in closing. What are some of the fundamental changes that will emerge if a culture is grounded on the inclusive, higher order process values of 21st century leadership? One of the changes will be how women are more fully integrated into the very fabric of organizations. through jettisoning latent and not so latent misogynist habits of mind. Habits that insist on the diminution of women's talents, creativity, and work that are perpetuated through glass ceilings and unequal pay. These values are part and parcel of an industrial worldview in which males and the rational linear model dominated how society saw the world. These held over habits of mind are alive and well in many organizational cultures, whether they be clearly spoken or unspoken. They are evident in the positions and unequal pay that many women experience. The unequal position of women in most organizations is representative of the limitations of the 18th century industrial model for organizations and leadership. By incorporating a new leadership metaphor and using mindfulness as a way to change our habits of mind, we will shift our consciousness to higher order values that recognize the inclusive style and perspective that women bring to leading in business. We will begin to realize how important women are in our organizations and the gifts women bring to developing a globally sustainable economy whose organizations are humanizing, an economy based on mindful organizations that will do well while doing good. Thank you.